Welcome to today's deep dive.
Hmm.
We're going to be taking a look at The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, Islam. It's a book by Douglas Murray that's caused quite a stir.
Yeah, it really delves into some pretty sensitive and complicated questions about Europe's future, especially with all the mass immigration. And Islam plays a big role in all this, how it all ties into European identity. It's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. So before we even get into the book's arguments, maybe we should give everyone a little background on who Douglas Murray is.
Right. So Douglas Murray is a British author, journalist, and political commentator. He's known for having pretty conservative views.
And he's a big voice in the whole discussion about immigration, Islam, and how European identity is changing.
Yeah, he's really prominent in those circles. And he's also the associate editor of The Spectator, which, as you know, is a pretty well-known platform for conservative thought.
That's right. Murray definitely doesn't shy away from controversial topics. I mean, he dives right in. In fact, he starts the book with a statistic from the 2011 UK census that's really startling. It said that in 23 of London's 33 boroughs, white Britons were actually a minority.
That's a pretty significant demographic shift. And,
Yeah.
what's really striking is that it was barely reported on at the time. I mean, this is a huge change with potentially huge implications for British society, and it just seems to have flown under the radar.
It's almost like it was too sensitive to talk about. But Murray uses that census data as a jumping off point to get to his main argument, and that is that mass immigration is fundamentally changing Europe.
Yeah, he's really challenging readers to think about what level of diversity is actually acceptable. And he even asks whether the people who are pushing for mass immigration even have a target percentage in mind.
It's a question that a lot of people are probably thinking about, but don't necessarily say out loud. I mean, many Europeans are feeling anxious about how quickly things are changing, what it all means for their future, their culture, their sense of belonging.
Absolutely. And to really understand where we are now, Murray takes us back and looks at the history of immigration in Europe after World War II. He makes the point that immigration on this scale was never planned. And of course, it's had some really significant consequences, both positive and negative.
He talks about things like the Notting Hill riots in 1958, which was a pretty violent clash between West Indian immigrants and white Londoners.
Hmm.
It's kind of an example of the racial tensions that can happen when you have different cultures living close together, especially when there's social and economic stress.
Right. And it's important to remember that while Murray talks about these tensions, he emphasizes that those kinds of violent events were rare. Most of the time, things were peaceful. Even attempts to use those tensions for political gain, like what Oswald Mosley tried to do, they didn't really work.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Oswald Mosley was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. He was a pretty controversial figure. But the fact that he failed shows that most people didn't want that kind of extremism. They wanted peaceful solutions, even when things were tough.
Exactly. And then Murray brings up a common argument that people use to downplay concerns about immigration and national identity. And that's the idea that we're all foreigners, really, because we all have ancestors from different places. He even uses the example of that Channel 4 documentary called 100% English. They did DNA tests on white British people and showed how diverse their heritage was.
And the documentary seemed to be suggesting that because nobody's really purely English, then concerns about immigration aren't valid.
Right. And Murray argues that you never hear that logic applied to other groups who are worried about preserving their own cultural identity. It's like a double standard that he sees being used against white Europeans.
Now, if we move on to the economics of immigration, one of the big arguments is that Europe needs immigrants because birth rates are falling and the population is aging. The idea is that bringing in young people can help fill the workforce and address that problem.
Right. But Murray's counterargument is that it's kind of a short-sighted solution because, those young people will get older too, so then you'll need even more immigrants, and it just creates this sort of demographic pyramid scheme.
And he's also critical of the argument that Europeans just won't do certain jobs. He brings up this example of a pro-EU entrepreneur who said he didn't want his daughter to be a potato picker. It sort of reveals a kind of class bias that certain jobs are beneath native Europeans.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder why there are so many unemployed young people in Europe who could be doing those jobs.
Instead of focusing on the problems of unemployment and lack of job training for those who are already there, the solution seems to be to just bring in more workers from other countries.
Exactly. And then Murray tackles another argument that often comes up to justify mass immigration, and that's the need for diversity to make Europe more vibrant and exciting, especially when it comes to things like food.
But that argument kind of assumes that European culture on its own is boring or lacking something.
Yeah, it's like saying Europe needs outside help to be interesting.
Now, up until now, we've been talking about immigration in a more general sense. But Murray brings it to what he sees as the most important point, that immigration isn't just about race, it's also about creed, specifically Islam.
He argues that the ideologies and religious beliefs of immigrants, especially those from Muslim-majority countries, haven't really been part of the discussion about immigration policies.
And he goes on to look at some specific examples of how this has played out in Europe, and sometimes with pretty bad consequences. Like, for example, he talks about the Rochdale grooming gangs in the UK. There was a horrible case where groups of Muslim men were abusing young white girls.
What made it even worse was that the authorities were hesitant to investigate because they were afraid of being called racist. So the abuse went on for years, and it just highlights how dangerous it can be to prioritize political correctness over the safety of vulnerable people.
And then Murray looks at Angela Merkel's decision back in 2015 to open Germany's borders to this huge influx of migrants, many of whom were Muslim.
It was a controversial decision, for sure. Some people praised her for being humanitarian, but others criticized it, and it's still being debated today. The long-term consequences for Germany are still playing out.
Murray links that decision to the rise in crime and social unrest that we've seen in Europe. He mentions the terrorist attacks in Paris and Nice as examples.
He also talks about how there's this clash of values happening between European ideals like free speech and secularism and Islamic blasphemy laws. He brings up the Salman Rushdie affair, where the author got a fatwa against him for his book, The Satanic Verses. Some Muslims considered it blasphemous.
Yeah, there were even public burnings of the book in England, and some people in the UK were actually calling for Islamic blasphemy laws to be put in place. It just goes to show how different cultural and religious viewpoints can create real tension, especially when it comes to freedom of expression.
Exactly. He also discusses the experience of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's a Somali-born activist who's been very critical of Islam, especially in terms of women's rights.
Right, and because she spoke out against Islam, she faced a lot of backlash and threats. She even had to live under police protection. It really shows how difficult it can be to criticize religion, particularly Islam.
Then Murray starts to talk about this more philosophical idea that he calls existential tiredness. It's this feeling of exhaustion and lack of purpose in Europe, a loss of faith in European values and traditions.
It's not just about economics or demographics, it's deeper than that. He's talking about a kind of spiritual crisis. And he connects it to a few different things.
One is the decline of Christianity, and how secular substitutes, like art, haven't really been able to fill that void of meaning and purpose. He even talks about Richard Wagner, the composer.
I mean, Wagner saw art as this potential replacement for religion. But even he couldn't find lasting comfort in it, according to Murray.
Right. And then Murray also points to the weight of history on Europe. The Holocaust, colonialism, slavery, all of that can lead to a sense of guilt and fatigue. And he's also critical of this modern obsession with deconstruction in philosophy.
For people who aren't familiar with that term, deconstruction is basically this philosophical approach that tries to undermine traditional ways of thinking. It looks for contradictions in power dynamics and language and systems of thought.
Right. And Murray argues that while deconstruction can be intellectually interesting, it often avoids dealing with the big existential questions that actually give life meaning.
So, if Europe is tired, disillusioned, and unsure of its own values, where does that leave us, according to Murray?
Well, he doesn't paint a very optimistic picture of the future. He's worried that new migrants might not embrace European values and could actually make this existential tiredness worse.
And he's critical of European leaders for ignoring the concerns that people have about immigration and integration. He thinks this disconnect just fuels more disillusionment and resentment.
Yeah, he even predicts that Europe will become a nation of immigrants, where its own unique culture and identity get diluted and possibly even lost.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you wonder what Europe will look like in the years to come.
And how all of these changes will impact the lives of both native Europeans and the people who are coming in.
Murray also draws a comparison between how Europe treats Muslim critics of Islam, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Majid Nawaz, and how it treats people who uphold traditional European values.
Yeah, he points out that the people who criticize Islam, who are often doing so at great personal risk, get ostracized and labeled as Islamophobic. But the people who support the status quo, even if it means compromising European values or ignoring concerns about integration, they get praised and celebrated.
It's like Europe is bending over backward to be tolerant, even if it means sacrificing its own cultural heritage and silencing dissenting voices.
Right. And to drive this point home, Murray argues that other countries are taking advantage of European goodwill.
He uses the example of Saudi Arabia. They refused to take in Syrian refugees, but at the same time, they were offering to build mosques in Germany.
It's like Europe is carrying the burden for everyone else.
It's a very complicated issue.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've laid out the main points of Murray's argument, but it's important to remember that this book has been incredibly controversial. People have really strong opinions about it, both for and against.
Yeah, some critics are accusing Murray of fear-mongering and presenting a really biased view of Islam. They say he's ignoring all the positive contributions of Muslim immigrants and how they're trying to integrate and live peacefully.
They also point to Europe's history of successfully absorbing immigrants from different backgrounds. They think Murray's being too pessimistic about Europe's ability to adapt.
Right, right. But on the other hand, a lot of people, even those who might not agree with everything Murray says, they appreciate that he's willing to talk about a topic that's so sensitive and often avoided.
They see his book as a really important contribution to this debate about immigration and the future of Europe. They find his analysis of Europe's existential crisis insightful, even if they don't agree with his solutions.
It's definitely a book that's gotten people talking, no doubt about it. So before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, let's just quickly recap what we've talked about so far. Basically, Murray argues that Europe is in danger of destroying itself through mass immigration and the erosion of its identity.
He sees it as this big crisis that's not just about demographics or economics, but also about culture and even spirituality, and it's all leading to this existential tiredness.
He's saying that the amount of immigration, especially from Muslim-majority countries, has been huge and unplanned. And he thinks that European leaders have failed to address people's legitimate concerns about integration and preserving European values and traditions.
Right, and he points to examples like the issues surrounding free speech and blasphemy, the treatment of women, and the integration of Islamic law into European legal systems.
And he's really challenging this idea that diversity is always a good thing. He thinks that the push for multiculturalism has come at the expense of European culture and heritage.
And his prediction for the future of Europe is pretty bleak. He thinks Europe's identity will continue to erode and that there will be more social and cultural conflicts unless things change.
It's a lot to think about. What do you think? Do you agree with Murray's assessment of Europe's future? Or do you think he's being too pessimistic?
It's a really important question, and we're going to keep exploring it in the next part of our deep dive.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Okay, so as we dig deeper into the strange death of Europe, let's talk about another part of Murray's argument. His idea that Europe needs to get back to tradition.
Yeah, this is where he gets really philosophical. He's basically saying that Europeans need to reconnect with their cultural and religious roots, especially Christianity. He thinks that even for people who aren't religious, these traditions give a sense of belonging, purpose, a kind of moral compass. And he thinks that's been lost in all this focus on secularism and multiculturalism.
He argues that these traditions have shaped Europe for centuries. They're what made it what it is. And if Europe abandons them, it'll become kind of lost, like a ship without a rudder, open to all kinds of outside influences without any strong core to hold it together.
It's interesting to think about, even if you're not a religious person, it makes you wonder, what holds a society together? What happens when those common bonds start to weaken?
Definitely. It's almost like Europe is so busy trying to accommodate everyone else that it's forgetting about its own people.
And Murray thinks that this is what's leading to resentment and disillusionment, which is just fueling those populist movements and nationalist feelings that we're seeing all over Europe.
It's a tough situation, that's for sure. There are no easy answers.
It's a balancing act, trying to welcome people who need help, while also protecting the culture and values that define a nation.
And Murray's book, even though it's controversial, it reminds us that these are conversations we can't afford to avoid. We need to talk openly and honestly about the challenges and the possibilities of multiculturalism.
Even if those conversations make us uncomfortable or make us rethink our own beliefs.
It's about finding ways to navigate all of this while still holding on to the values that have always been important to Europe. Values like tolerance, respect, and human dignity.
So, as we finish up our deep dive into the strange death of Europe, we hope you'll take some time to think about Murray's arguments, even if you don't agree with all of them. Talk about it with other people, explore different points of view, and come to your own conclusions.
It's through dialogue and critical thinking that we can figure out how to handle these complex issues that are facing Europe and the rest of the world. We hope this deep dive has been thought-provoking and helpful for you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.